Gospel of Mark, chapter 8, verses 31 through 36. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it. Those who lose their life for my sake, for the sake of the gospel, will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life?"
This one didn't even require your commentary, did it? Jesus said it all for you. Wow. Let us give thanks for the lessons that we get to learn. So, how many of you are shocked, horrified, discomfited by this particular text? You don't have to raise your hands, just, because the bigger question is, if you're not, why not? Jesus, throughout Mark's gospel, holds a tension between knowing his identity and sharing his identity openly. Many people, upon being healed, understand that this is the anointed one, the Messiah, and they want to rush out into the world and tell everyone that they met the Messiah. Every time that happens, Jesus shushes them, commands them to silence. Don't tell anyone, he says. Here, I think, we begin to see why. Not long before this moment, Peter himself correctly identifies Jesus, understands who it is that he has been following. But that identification, that ability to say, "You are the Messiah," that is not enough. And there is Peter, standing in for all of the people who have already been cautioned to silence, demonstrating just how easily we can acknowledge someone's identity without grasping the fullness of all that that identity means. And honestly, who can blame Peter here? Aren't we all Peter in so many ways? Peter has finally been able to name the movement that he is following, that the movement that he has become involved in, and that it is the movement of God in the world. He is following the sovereign, the ruler of the world in which he wants to live, or at least thinks he wants to live. Because let us remember that the title Son of Man, which Jesus uses, we just lost that slide, but Jesus uses, is the same title that the Caesar uses. That is what the ruler of the empire calls himself. Jesus has a sense of irony. And the concept of the Messiah, the anointed one, that's what Messiah means, points us back to King David. So all of the analogies that Jesus is drawing on, all of the analogies to his identity, are analogies to human rulers, powerful men of the world, successful by all of the metrics of human culture. So saying that Jesus is the Messiah or the Son of Man raises an image in the minds of anyone who hears that of victorious armies, shining, mail, chainmail, and bright standards and gleaming swords and celebrations of conquest. That's the image. And for someone like Peter, who lives under an empire in which the armies and conquests are more likely to oppress him and his people than to bring them victory or status, the idea of being aligned with a Messiah, aligned with a Son of Man who is on his side, is the idea of being aligned with the winner, with the victor for once. You begin to see why it's tempting. We talked last week about how there isn't really a narrated series of temptations in Mark's gospel. Mark says, oh, and Jesus was tempted, but we skip over that whole conversation with the devil. Here's the big one from the other gospels. Not in the mouth of some amorphous devil figure, but in the mouth of Simon Peter. In the mouth of Jesus, maybe first most beloved disciple. There's the temptation. Don't you want to rule the world on human terms there, Jesus? Don't you want to be for your own people what Caesar is to the Romans, what Nebuchadnezzar was to the Babylonians, what Pharaoh was to the Egyptians? Don't you want to hold power over the world, lifting yourself up by standing on those below? Don't you just want power for power's sake, for your own sake, so that you can do unto others what they have done unto you? Satan didn't offer that in Mark's gospel. Peter offers that in Mark's gospel. Ooh, hits way closer to home. Don't you want that, Jesus? You could have that, Jesus. But if that's what Peter wants, I think he's probably following the wrong person. And Jesus? Jesus is having none of that. Oh, Jesus is having none of that. Stop tempting me, Peter, Jesus yells, with understandable emotion, because none of what he's saying in that moment is easy even for him. Jesus shouts at Peter to stop tempting him because Jesus is tempted, as any of us would be. He turns to Peter and says, "This is not the sort of realm that you know. This is not the sort of power that you're expecting. This is not the sort of power that anyone is expecting. So yes, there will be rejection, and yes, there will be suffering, and yes, it will be scary enough to everyone who maintains the familiar systems of power and to everyone who grasps the implications of God made flesh walking around in this world, that it will be easier for those in power to engage in torture and murder than it will be for them to accept this new realm. Then it will be for them to accept this new form of power, this new victory that leaves no room at all for oppression in any form over anyone." Yeah, it is super #relatable. That said, we don't like relating to Peter, do we? We have all read our Bibles enough to know that Jesus doesn't end up being the Galilean version of Caesar, with chariots and swords and spears, marching in to conquer land. We all know, we've read this part, that the very thing that he tells Peter here, suffering, rejection, death in the immediate future, yes, that's going to happen. We even get to know that the resurrection wasn't a military victory and doesn't turn him into the new King David taking out the Roman Goliath. We've read the book that didn't exist when Peter was there, so we know this. And still, we are indeed Peter, and Peter is us. Peter's voice whispers down through time, noting all of the ways that we still see Jesus by that identity and all of our preconceived notions around what a Messiah should be. We still hear the whisper of Peter evoking all of the imagery of the Son of Man, the Caesar, the human ruler with human power in Christian garb. It has trickled down the centuries. It showed up in the Crusades. It showed up in colonization that brought the backwards natives to Christ. Blech. But it showed up not 100 years ago in Cold War politics that explicitly positioned Christian America against godless communism. And it shows up now. It still does. In all of the subtle ways that we scarcely even notice or consider because they're so normal. They're every bit as normal as seeing the image of the Caesar in our heads when we hear the phrase Son of Man. It comes up in art and music and popular theology, the sort that ends up on the shelves at Hobby Lobby, all of which still imagines Jesus as leading a new empire, as the force who will make us, each of us, individually successful and victorious. This is the sort of imagery that misreads verses like the one from Philippians, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me, which we too often apply to success on human terms rather than on overcoming the very temptation that got Peter into so much trouble in the first place. That is such a popular phrase, by the way, that when I went to type it in so that I could preach the sermon, I got as far as I can do, and the rest of it filled in and auto-completed. Even my computer has bad theology. And as much as we want a text like this one to show how much more we understand than poor Peter, poor little Peter, as much as we want a text like this to be only about the story of Jesus, the man who lived 2,000 years ago, and about the first disciples who have long been dead and buried, the Bible rarely works that way. And this is a story for us as well. Because the Son of Man is indeed despised and rejected. The Messiah suffers and dies. But that is not Jesus' story alone. All who follow, including us, are to take up our own crosses, to lose and gain our lives, to realign from human understandings and empire to a realm that looks more like God than it does like us. And of course, this is not to say that we are to stop breathing, to stop our hearts beating. That is not what lose your life means, just to be really, really clear about that. It means lose our way of life, change our direction, change all of the things that we're living for in the core of our being. This text is as much a call as it ever was to Peter and those original followers, not to be tempted by the easy and the familiar, the standard comfortable images of power and status, the oppression and injustice that we are so used to that we don't even notice them anymore. Jesus tells us, as well as Peter, to take up the symbols of humiliation and dehumanization that our culture hangs on to. Jesus tells us, as well as Peter, to willingly accept on our own bodies and our own selves the myriad forms of dehumanization that our own society imposes upon so many. Some of us do not have that as a choice. But there are many, many forms of dehumanization. And there are many, many ways to stand in solidarity. As tempting as it is to see Jesus only in his glory, only in his victory, to see the Messiah only for the good things that he can bring to us, discipleship is not that simple. Because the glory of the kingdom that we long for can only exist when we stop seeking power over others, even as we ourselves are sometimes trampled and shoved aside. When we stop wanting to do unto others as people have done unto us before this. When we actively resist oppression in all of its forms. The realm of God towards which we work can only come into being when we willingly bear witness to the ways that people in our own world are being crucified and humiliated and dehumanized and left to die. When we lift up our own crosses to bear that pain with them. When we interpose our own bodies between the violence of a fearful world and the lives of those who are suffering and despised and rejected. There is so much need in this world among those who are left behind, trampled upon by the world, who are seen only as their difference rather than in the fullness of who they are, who are seen through our preconceived notions every bit as much as the Messiah ever was. But what are our lives if we live them only for ourselves? What is our discipleship if we do not stand in solidarity with those whom God loves, even when the world does not? We, like Peter, hold certain ideas of what a Messiah and what a Son of Man is and should be. We, like Peter, cherish certain concepts of power for the sake of ourselves and those in our immediate community. And we, like Peter, often struggle to see beyond the cultural norms in which we have always lived, the social structures that justify inequality and suffering. And so we, like Peter, push back against Jesus more often than we'd probably care to admit, tempted by a gospel that we'd rather find comfortable than comforting. The comfort of the gospel is not in the assurance of our glory or our victory. The comfort of the gospel is in the willingness of Jesus to teach us through ancient words made new in our hearing, and through a call that should indeed shock us, make us uncomfortable, because it should stand in contrast to the ways of empire with which we are so familiar. And yet that is the call that can lead us into the reality of a kingdom that God has so long dreamed for us. The comfort of the gospel is not in being smarter or better than Peter was. I don't know that we are. It is rather in the reminder that the sharp rebuke of Peter did not change his belovedness, did not evict him from discipleship, did not change the call that Jesus had put before him any more than any one of our own temptations, our own mistakes will ever change the call that is upon us and the belovedness that trusts us to follow. Texts like this one should shock us, should shake us out of our complacency every bit as much as they shocked Peter. They rattle our preconceptions and our comfort with familiar empires and unjust systems. They should call us away from the dismissiveness of the world to a solidarity with all of God's beloved, even though it may well break our hearts and make us incredibly unpopular dinner guests. The call should shock us because that call is the grace that continues to call us in by the God who believes in our ability to see beyond the temptations of this world, to love beyond our own sense of power, to nurture solidarity in suffering and in joy, in the discipleship that both breaks us open and makes us new. Thanks be to our God indeed. Amen.